Anthony Spencer. This is Monarch and Moreau. In this video, I'm going to talk about selling at premium prices. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Monarch and Moreau. And this channel is dedicated to funeral professionals who, although they don't have the lowest price, they wouldn't mind making the most money. I just want to be real clear what the value proposition is here at Monarch and Moreau. We help you increase your bargaining power at the point of sale, at the bargaining table. Bargaining power! That's what our training is about. If you haven't seen the previous videos, then you need to go back through those. We're talking about emotional labor, its demands, and how proper execution of emotional labor through high emotional intelligence is really the prime service quality differentiator. It goes to quality, it goes to reliability, and it is the value behind the increase in price for those who can command a premium price. Now, we're going to examine why people struggle to command a premium price, why they struggle to display their bargaining power at the point of sale. We're talking about selling the difference, distinction, creating it. How do we create that contrast in comparison to our competitors? Do you smell what the rock is cooking? I'm going to give you one way to do that in this video. Now, when you're in the service industry, specifically, you're a caregiver seller, which means maybe you work for hospice, palliative care, you're a funeral director, but you're also required to sell. Your inventory is really the emotional intelligence that's embodied in your staff. And your deliverable is the emotional labor that you deliver for families when you care for them, when you serve them. But what's the difference between what you deliver, your emotional labor, and your staff's emotional intelligence, the things that underline the service quality? Difference, right? They're intricate. They're intangible, right? They're nuanced. How do you bring those to life so your prospects and referral partners can see that distinction? And although you don't have the lowest price, the price is easy because you have the clearest promise. How do you sell the difference? How do you bring it to life? So one part of selling is understanding the landscape. And I'm a big proponent of having a lexicon and a methodology that you can share amongst your staff, this shared knowledge, shared understanding, so you can have a shared vision. And I don't believe you can have too much success, especially when it comes to market conquest or having power at the point of sale at the bargaining table, unless you have that shared vision from that shared lexicon. And if you want to be different, you got to talk about things differently, right? You can't say the same things everybody else says. You can't look at the market with the same eyes everybody else looks at it with. We got to have new eyes. We got to have a vision, right? Something that sets us apart. So when it comes to social selling with reviews, testimonials, here's how I want you to look at it. Let's not look at it as somebody's got a 4-star rating, a 5-star rating. Let's break it down using 6 Sigma and let's see what we find. So what is 6 Sigma? Some of you are probably asking that, right? You don't use it every day. I'm going to get into that. But when it comes to selling the difference, right, where those differences are intangible, they're intricate, they're nuanced, 6 Sigma is going to come through. It's going to help us really bring to life those differences. What 6 Sigma really is a way to measure success and failure and to determine your failure rate and maybe where failures are occurring in the value chain so that they can be eliminated and consistency can be improved. They don't want a lot of variability in the product, in the service, and they want it to be consistent. And so 6 Sigma is a way to measure that. Now, the gold standard for 6 Sigma is only 3.4 errors per 1 million opportunities. Now, if you want to sound different, sell the difference, and get a leg up on your competitors, then this video is for you because I'm going to show you how to use 6 Sigma to stand apart. Do you smell what the rock is cooking? So 6 Sigma is a measuring tool to identify weaknesses in the value chain and then remove them. The thing to remember is that the higher the Sigma, the better the quality level. The lower the Sigma, the worse the quality level. And higher Sigma levels correlate with higher customer satisfaction, higher employee retention, higher profitability. All the companies that we're going to look at are real companies. In fact, these 3 companies are somewhat clustered together. 2 of them, all 3 of them are competitors. 2 of them are technically on the same team. They're separate locations for the same major corporate entity. And then this first one is their competitor. Now, this first one has a 4.5-star Google rating and over 200 reviews. And these are real companies. I think most people would look at a 4.5 Google rating with over 200 reviews and say that's a pretty solid representation of this company. That indicates at least a solid company with a good reputation. Would you agree with that? So let's say you're at 4.5 stars and you're this provider. How are you different from somebody maybe with 4.3 rating? Not a big difference. Or how are you different from somebody with a 4.8, 4.9 rating? Are you different? What's the difference? Do you smell what The Rock is cooking? We're going to find that out by going a step further. Listen, anybody look at a Google rating. But if you want to be different, if you really want to be a master of the market, you got to be able to dissect the market and look at it with different eyes through the lens of Six Sigma and find out what type of insights we can uncover, what type of comparison and contrast we can create so that we can make the difference clear and our price easy so that we have power at the point of sale at the bargaining table. We're going to uncover all that starting with this first provider, 4.5-star rating on Google, more than 200 reviews. Let's look at it through the lens of Six Sigma and see what we find out. So back to the 4.5 rating, 210 reviews. Now you might be a little surprised when we look at case study number 1 because out of those 210 reviews, despite that high Google rating or relatively high, 4.5, 26 of those reviews have been unsatisfactory, have been negative, have been defects in the value chain. Do you smell what The Rock is cooking? Now, I bet the staff at the provider with 210 reviews and a 4.5 rating thinks to themselves they're a high-quality care facility. Let's examine Six Sigma's level based on this defect rate. 26 out of 210. Remember, the higher the sigma, the better. So 26 defects out of 210 opportunities equals sigma level of 2.25. Let's put some perspective to that. In reality, I talk to so many people who think their service level is high, but when we really look at it under the objective microscope, we find some questions there. And so do you see how this works? Do you smell what The Rock is cooking? Regardless of where you're situated, whether you're this provider or you're a competitive provider analyzing this provider, you can paint any picture you want. You can tell any story you want as long as you can command the facts. You can control the narrative. When we look at this provider, despite a 4.5 Google rating, despite over 200 reviews, which in this industry signifies that they're getting a fairly good amount of business, but it conceals a troubling reality that 1 out of every 8 customers receives a negative experience. That's a 12.3, almost a 12.4 defect rate. That's a 2.25 sigma level, despite the higher perceived Google rating. That rating is really deceptive because it gives the appearance of quality, but it hides the real risks beneath the surface. 1 out of 8 receive a negative experience at this provider. And this is why I say I want to take the gloves off, because imagine talking to Mr. or Mrs. Business Owner with a 4.5 Google rating, 200 reviews. They're proud of their business, and they should be, right? When you're at a 2.25 sigma level, do you smell what The Rock is cooking? It reflects low service quality. And to tell them that sometimes very heartbreaking. But when you're at a 2.25 sigma level, you're operating with about 124,000 defects per million. There's a 1 in 8 chance that each customer that walks through the door is going to have a negative experience. Do you smell what The Rock is cooking? It's not a good thing. And to take the gloves off, do you think for some people, maybe in the business, who think they're doing good, their business is good, they really hang their hat on that 4.5-star rating, but then they wonder why their business isn't taking off? Why aren't they noteworthy? See, these ratings, these testimonials for most of you are meaningless. Why aren't they prestigious? Because they look just like everybody else's reviews and testimonials. Do you smell what The Rock is cooking? How do you create that contrast so you can compare the two and you could command a premium price for it? Staff would know it. They'd be enthusiastic about selling it so that you can make your promise clear and your price easy. Now remember, I said the gold standard Six Sigma level, only 3.4 defects per 1 million opportunities. Put this in perspective. General Electric, Motorola pioneered this. And there are some of the few companies to ever achieve Six Sigma. Now, most companies operate at half that, somewhere around 3 Sigma. When we evaluate company 1, we can see just from the numbers that if the average sigma is 3.0, 2.25 is below that. If the average error rate is 6.7, their error rate is 2 times that. So we have a 4.5 Google rating, 4.5 star Google rating. To most people indicates a high quality of service and reliability. But when we look at it through the lens of Six Sigma, we find that they have a 2.25 sigma level, which is below the average, which is about 3. And they have 2 times the error rate. Do you smell what The Rock is cooking? The average is about 6.7, and their error rate is almost 13%. So 1 in 8 have a negative experience with this provider. So this provider has a 4.5 star Google rating. They have over 200 reviews, and they have an error rate of about 13%, which means they have a success rate of about 87%. So 87% of the time they're successful, but their sigma level is 2.25, which is below the average, which is about 3 3 sigma. So does this constitute as poor sigma performance? Well, poor performers are in the 1 to 2 sigma area, which is sort of like when you're in the 1 to 2 area, you're like those bad fast food chains from the 90s where there was those long lines, bad orders, cold food, soggy french fries. Do you smell what the Rock is cooking? That's 1 to 2 sigma. And so it's not that bad at this location. And that's really a two-edged sword because it's insidious now. It's kind of going unnoticed. We've got this false perception of our service quality, and we're unlikely to do anything about it. Even if you have a 4.5 Google rating, and really regardless of what your Google rating is, there's enough public data out there to determine if you really do have a high quality of service that's consistent. Do you smell what the Rock is cooking? And reliable. Let's look at case study number 2. And in this one, we've got almost 200 reviews, a little bit less. We've got 189, and we've got a 4.9 Google rating. Let's see what the foundation for this 4.9 rating is. Out of 189 opportunities, how many defects did they have? And when we look, this provider had 2 with exactly 187 5-star reviews, 4.9. When you only have 2 negative outcomes in almost 200 opportunities, that's a 1.06% defect rate and a 3.8 sigma level. This company operates at a significantly higher level of quality than company 1. Do you smell what the Rock is cooking? See, in a commoditized market where everybody competes on price, even though they say they don't, they talk about value, but they don't know the value behind their price. They can't talk about it. They don't know the difference between them and what others are offering, especially when we're talking about intangible service deliverables. So this is how we're going to do it. If we're the 4.9 provider, we can make clear and compelling evidence that even though a 4.5 rating sounds good, it carries with it a chance for error, a chance for regret, chance for regret, more than 10 times what we're offering. Do you smell what the Rock is cooking? Said another way, Mr. Customer, our service delivery is literally and objectively 10x better than theirs. Even though they purport to be comparable to us and it looks like they're good enough with a cheaper price, they're 10x worse than we are. Do you smell what the Rock is cooking? When we talk about having power at the bargaining table, we talk about having that distinct value, quantifiable value that we can bring to life persuasively, convincingly. Compare the 4.9 and the 3.8 sigma level provider to the 4.5, 2.25 sigma level provider. You've got a big gap that you can now demonstrate. I mean, how much would you pay to be 10 times less likely to experience a problem? Just looking at the 2 companies, 1 in 100 or 1 in 8, which one is worth more? Do you smell what the Rock is cooking? Now, we're talking about power at the bargaining table, commanding premium prices. We're talking about being powerful and persuasive, selling the difference. How much are you going to pay in difference for a 4.5 to a 4.9 rating? If you're just merely in your mind, you're moving from a provider who's 4.5 to a provider that's 4.9. Neither one of them are 5 after all. They're both below 5. How much are you paying for that? But contrast that with how much are you paying to be 10x less likely to incur an error in this very important thing that you need done. Do you smell what the Rock is cooking? I think most people are going to pay more, not for the difference in Google rating, but for the difference in error rate. Am I right? But that's based on your ability to command the facts, control the narrative, and tell the story. Do you smell what the Rock is cooking? For our third example, let's analyze an even closer comparison, right? How do we create comparison and contrast between 2 providers that look almost identical? One has a 4.8 rating and you have a 4.9 rating. What's the difference? What's the difference that we can find that we can sell? So I'm going to imagine that your company number 2, you've got the 4.9 Google rating and you only have 2 defects in 189 opportunities. You operate at an above average 3.8 sigma. And within the corporate structure, you're competing for bonuses, you're competing for pay raise, merit increases. You want to demonstrate that your performance as a manager is superior to the other locations in your area. And with competitor 1 now, the difference between 4.9 and 4.5, we've fleshed that out. We've brought that to life. We've shown that you have more than a 10x probability of coming out ahead with us versus the cheaper, good enough, look-alike service. But this is for when we run into those competitors whose price is so low that it looks like it dwarfs our difference. Now imagine your prospect tells you that the good enough, cheaper competitor that looks just like you costs half as much as you do. They're at a $5,000 price point for essentially the same thing, at least in the prospect's mind, as you're offering for $10,000. You're only 1 percentage point better in rating. The cheaper provider's at 4.8, you're at 4.9, you're both under 5. And you're trained in products, prices, and procedures. You're not skilled in contextual communication. You don't know how to deliver this price information in a way that's persuasive and powerful at the bargaining table. So you kind of look like the odd one out, right? You're at least twice as expensive as everyone else. So remember what I said and what I've been saying about caregivers who are also salespeople who find themselves at that intersection of having to deliver compassionate, empathetic care, but then also having the pressure of the sales quota, the pressure from management to sell, to upsell. And if you don't know the logic behind your price, if you don't know the value behind your price, you can't compute it, you can't bring it to life, you can't quantify it. How are you going to push it? How are you going to sit down at the point of sale at the bargaining table and tell a family that they should pay more? They should pay twice as much for a service that looks almost identical on paper. 1 percentage point, 4.9 to 4.8. Why should they pay twice as much for your service? Do you smell what the rock is cooking? Why should they? Well, one reason why they might is because 5 negative outcomes out of 164 opportunities is a lower sigma, a higher defect rate, a 3 times higher defect rate, in fact. And while it's still above average, it's marketably less than our second company with a 4.9 rating and the 3.8 sigma. Would you pay twice as much for a product that's more than 3 times as reliable as its lower priced competitor? Now, that's an extreme example, but you could make that argument. And some people would. And depending on the circumstances, you would. 5 negatives out of 64 for our third company translates into a 3.4 sigma level. And that's almost about 30,500 defects for every 1 million. So the 4.8 rated provider has a defect rate of about 3.5 for every 100 opportunities, where the provider just 1 percentage point above them at 4.9 has a defect rate almost 3.5 times less than that at just over 1 per 100 opportunities. So the difference between 3.4, 3.8 sigma, 4.9, 4.8 Google rating may seem small in numbers, but it represents a significant difference in terms of consistency and customer satisfaction. Company B at 3.8 sigma provides at least 3 times more reliability and predictability in service quality than company C at 3.4 sigma, even though both perform above average. Remember, salespeople are going to have a hard time pushing the sale, and specifically caregiving salespeople. They're not going to push the sale unless they think there's a rational basis that justifies it. Hey, can I ask you something real quick, just since I got you here, just between you and me personally, off the record, of course? How much more valuable to you would a 300% reduction in risk be? Now, here's the reason why I ask, why I bring that up, right? When I talk about dissonance, there's a chain sequence that is very insidious, and it begins anytime there's a requirement for emotional labor and sales quotas. If you haven't watched any of our videos before, then you might not be aware of this. But anytime there's a need for emotional labor, for instance, let's take a funeral director, and they're required to maintain a composed and empathetic demeanor at all times. They want to come off as caring and compassionate. That is the professional and commercial requirements of that job. And they have to do that even if they're facing personal emotional struggles of their own, right? They have this expectation to constantly present a caring front, regardless of their internal state. And that's the hallmark of emotional labor. The effect that that has on people who have to deliver that type of labor is blurred emotions, right? The constant emotional regulation creates disconnect between authentic feelings and then the emotional requirements of the role, and that produces a lot of internal stress. Now, blurred emotions create blurred identity, right? Exasperated when we throw in the need for a sales quota. When sales targets and performance metrics are introduced into the caregiving mix, the professional is now forced to navigate two conflicting roles: passionate caregiver and effective salesperson. The effect is that the need to juggle these two roles blurs emotions and professional identity and makes it difficult to reconcile caregiving values with commercial demands. Now, if you don't know the value behind your price and you've got a manager pushing you to sell at higher prices, it's going to create some real moral distress, right? Although you're well versed in the 3 Ps product pricing and procedure, you have absolutely no clue how to quantify or articulate the value behind your price, and you're struggling to meet your sales quota and maintain the integrity of your caregiving role, your giving identity. And the idea of selling services to vulnerable families at a time when maybe they're losing or have just lost a loved one is ethically troubling for you. Do you smell what the rock is cooking? The distress that arises from this conflict between your moral values and the actions that you feel you're being asked or required to take by your job can lead to feelings of guilt and a lot of discomfort, dissatisfaction with your role. Do you smell what the rock is cooking? And so when we look at burnout, right, and we look at how this develops over time, if a professional feels like they've been compromising their own ethical standards and maybe prioritizing sales over care, that type of moral distress can turn into something called moral injury. Do you smell what the rock is cooking? So, when you put pressure on an untrained caregiver seller who might be experiencing price pushback and they've only been trained in the three P's: products, pricing, and procedure, they might start to get the perception that sales is really exploitation. And they start to see their sales success as taking advantage of vulnerable people at inflated prices. And this intensifies their moral injury. And it's the perception that their success is really being achieved at someone else's demise. And it's just a confounding confluence of conflict, and it leads to a sense of shame and a feeling that professional success is really tainted by unethical practices. Now, if this is you and you're having to deal with this emotional toil, you might start to maybe depersonalize a little bit from your interactions, right? Create a little space, create a little psychological distance between you and clients, between you and your coworkers, you and management, even you and your family. Because at this point, depersonalization really serves as a defense mechanism for you and it protects against the emotional pain of moral injury. But depersonalization just leads to more cognitive dissonance, right? Where your actions and your beliefs start to be contrary to each other. And this dissonance is going to cause further psychological strain. And so, believe it or not, right? And if this is you, you're not alone. But believe it or not, when all this is going on, these combination of factors, this perfect storm, this constellation of mind states, as the professional becomes more conflicted and emotionally detached, they start to experience imposter syndrome. That's right. They start to doubt their abilities. They feel inadequate. They can't do their job effectively. They can't convey confidence at the point of sale, at the bargaining table. It's making everything harder and it's exasperating the emotional toil, further accelerating burnout. And if this is you or any of your staff, you or they are at an all time high for risk of burnout, risk of compassion fatigue. Whenever you have emotional labor and you combine that with moral conflict, moral and psychological strain, moral injury, you become increasingly more vulnerable and susceptible to compassion fatigue. And when compassion fatigue starts to set in, it really erodes your ability to empathize with other people. And that's the final stage, right? Emotional exhaustion and burnout, right? It's the cumulative effect of all these stressors: moral injury, cognitive dissonance, depersonalization, imposter syndrome, compassion fatigue. All this just leads straight to emotional exhaustion and burnout, right? It's the final stage in the chain reaction where your ability to cope is so depleted, it results in total burnout. It manifests as physical, emotional, mental exhaustion. It's total, it's complete. You're done. And it just makes it impossible for someone to continue in their role. And the first role that a person in this situation is going to give up is, of course, going to be the sales role, right? They never really identified with that role anyway. They weren't trained in that role. As they continue and progress toward burnout, their trajectory predicts that they're going to have severe sales apathy and they're just going to stop selling for you altogether on their road to burnout. Now, the reason I bring that up and I just lay a little foundation is because I talk about Six Sigma on the front end, customer facing, the Google ratings, the Google reviews, right? And we kind of get an idea for service quality, service reliability. But when we think about service quality, we have to really think about the service profit chain and the deep indicators. Now, if you don't know what the service profit chain is, or you've never heard of deep indicator, don't worry about it. I'll get into that. I'll explain that a little bit. Just basically, the service profit chain says that internal quality predicts external quality. And there's a lot of public information, again, where we can kind of come to some conclusions about what's going on in the back room, right? The HR to employee, management to employee, that backroom dynamic that really underlines and is the foundation of high quality service. And we can show how this insidious chain of emotional labor to burnout affects service quality. And there should be some evidence in the market for this. And there is. Emotional labor is the most expensive deliverable to produce when we're talking about human capital. And what I'm saying is that it's such a heavy toll that if you're going to produce above average Sigma levels of care, it's going to come at a heavy price to your staff when we're talking about human capital. So we're going to call this last case study 4, and it's going to drive my point home. It should demonstrate for you the high toll, the high cost of providing high quality emotional labor. And we're going to be able to find evidence for that. Take our two sister companies in the same city. The one company at a 3.8 sigma, the other at a 3.4 sigma, both providing above average levels of care. And if what I'm saying is true, we're going to find evidence for the high cost of providing this high level of emotional labor, and we can turn to more public information. We can take the combined reviews from Glassdoor and Indeed. We can listen. Do you smell what the Rock is cooking? To the sentiment of their staff. Now, what's both telling and interesting is that when we do that, we see that the Sigma levels are no longer above industry average. They're much, much lower. Now, contrary to the high Google rate, here we've got a defect rate of almost 32.5%, 177 negative experiences out of 546 opportunities. That's a dismal 1.15 sigma. But when we go over to Indeed, a larger sample size, we see that we've got 599 negative experiences out of a possible 1,585, almost a 40% defect rate, and an abysmal 1 sigma, right? Notice the inverse relationship to sample size here. So this is what I want you to think about when you think about evidence for moral injury, for cognitive dissonance, for causation, for burnout. I want you to see this right here. The high outward facing quality of care and then the internal low sigma. We're talking about a combined sigma with a fairly large sample size, 2,000 reviews at only 1.05 sigma. More than 3.5 employees per 10 have a bad experience. When sigma levels are this low, employee engagement is this low. That makes initiatives next to impossible. Not to mention your power at the point of sale, at the bargaining table, your ability to command a premium price. Do you smell what the Rock is cooking? And is a real challenge to operational effectiveness. When we look at Six Sigma levels, we look at internal quality. We also need to keep in mind that that's going to affect external quality at some point. And the best place to see this correlation firsthand is going to be in the service profit chain. Now, the service profit chain is a model that links profitability to customer loyalty and employee satisfaction, and it demonstrates how improving internal service quality and employee engagement can lead to improved customer satisfaction and ultimately profitability. The key idea is that happy employees create value through excellent service, leading to loyal customers and sustainable profit. Now, remember, there's a big difference in the quality of service between a 4.9 Google star rated provider, a 4.5 Google star rated provider. Now you know how to bring those differences to life, how to create that comparison and contrast, that real distinction. And remember that distinction between 4.5 and 4.9, you have more than a 10x probability of coming out ahead versus the cheaper, good enough 4.5 look-alike service. But there's a ticking time bomb lurking underneath that, and that's the high cost of emotional labor, and that's what's creating that drain on the internal sigma levels. When we talk about the profit value chain, we're talking about internal service quality, and that comes from the working environment, the tools, and the support provided to employees. Internal service quality really is a reflection of employee satisfaction. How satisfied are they with the tools to support the working environment? Do they feel empowered? Are they encouraged through recognition, or are they maybe dismayed by fear? And true or not, that's going to determine the productivity of the employee, their satisfaction level, right? Are they going to try beyond their satisfaction level? And if the employee isn't satisfied in producing, are customers going to be satisfied? If customers aren't satisfied, are they going to be loyal? If they're not loyal, They're not satisfied because your employees are not satisfied with the support that they have, and you have internally low sigma levels. It means you haven't made the first sale. You haven't sold your staff, your employee, on the value behind the price, the value behind the job that they do. You haven't equipped them to manage their emotional labor. This level of emotional strain and burnout is contagious, particularly in emotional labor fields where it's a key component of the very service deliverable. Just think about the effect of your new hires, those employees who haven't accumulated a lot of emotional fatigue, moral injury, and they're particularly vulnerable to the environment set by their more seasoned colleagues, right? In an organization like Company B with that high external sigma quality, but that low internal sigma level, that indicates that there's a widespread employee dissatisfaction trend brewing, and that contagion can spread. In environments where there are high emotional demands, staff have to rely on one another for support. And when that emotional residue of exposures to others' bad attitudes spread through the workforce, it really brings down that close knit, cohesive workforce that you need for resiliency. And when that happens, you're going to have the spread of diminished enthusiasm, more sales apathy and non participation, increased emotional toll. And over time, what that does is it normalizes dysfunction within your organization, right? The emotional exhaustion of senior staff members becomes normalized, and new employees come to view burnout and disengagement as inevitable outcomes of the job. Self fulfilling prophecy. As that happens, as dissonance and depersonalization rises and emotions get blurred, identity gets blurred, and you also have the erosion of personal identity. Do you smell what the rock is cooking? When your internal sigma levels are as low as 1.05, that means that more than 1 in 3 employees are experiencing severe dissatisfaction. And that's why the burnout and attrition levels are so high, and why I say this is a ticking time bomb, because you have these huge magnitudes of dissonance and disparity between external customer facing sigma levels and internal employee facing sigma levels. When this happens, emotional exhaustion spreads quickly, reduces your bargaining power at the point of sale, at the bargaining table. It reduces your team cohesiveness, increases your turnover and attrition, and it reduces your service quality. Now, if you want to learn more about this and you want to know what you can do about it, head over to the blog by clicking the link below. So I just got one final question. Do you think it's fair to demand this if what you're delivering is this? Right? Notice the inverse relationship to sample size here. I just want to be real clear what the value proposition is here at Monarch and Moreau. We help you increase your bargaining power at the point of sale, at the bargaining table. Bargaining power. So just remember, the higher the sigma level, the lower the failure rate, the lower the defect rate, and the more reliable the process.